Thank you, and thank you all, particularly the Kogut Institute, not Kogut Center, and all of you for all of your work, and for those who spoke earlier. You have imbued me with a great deal of anxiety about following in your footsteps. Nevertheless, what could you do? There will be no striving for precision here. Anarchy resists definition. Anarchy refuses both the commands and the confinement of definition. The anarchic will not be fenced in. In place of a concept, therefore, I offer conception, for anarchy is still growing. Anarchy is animated in part, if not in whole, by the spirit of negation. Begin, therefore, with what anarchy is not. Anarchy is not rule. Rather, it is the refusal of rule, the escape from rule, that which opposes rule. Above all, that disposition that sees rule as unnecessary and sets it aside. Anarchy is the evasion, resistance, and refusal of domination. That rejection of rule, of domination, is very broad indeed. I'm in my glasses now. Domination from abroad in settler colonialism or other forms of imperial rule, and domination from within are both rejected. Domination by force of arms or through coercion is rejected. Domination within and by communities, in the workplace, in churches, in masjids, shuls, and temples is rejected. Nietzsche wrote, "I hate to follow and I hate to lead. Obey, oh no, and govern, and no indeed." It's so good, it's so funny. Anarchism belongs first, I think, to those who hate to lead. They refuse to act as dictators, tyrants, autocrats, even, perhaps especially, managers. That is anathema. They resist hierarchies, but they can lead. They will lead if those that they lead consent to it and if the circumstances require it. They recognize, however, that leadership diminishes both the leader and the led. They would rather live among equals. If they cannot, these anarchists, they will prefer the virtue of magnanimity to a display of their superior capacities. Several recognitions impel their reluctance to obey. They know that they have the right to decide what is best for them. They love their freedom. They know the radical solitude of body and mind. What we feel, what we think, what we see, all that is finally closed to others. Anarchists know that most people, most of the time, do know what's best for them. They hate to obey, therefore, out of pride in their freedom, self-knowledge, and self-reliance. In both cases, the anarchic disposition defends radical individuality, egalitarianism, and the value of individual judgment. Anarchists have avoided the long debates over whether equality required that all be treated the same or if differences require different treatment. Anarchy presumes difference, values difference, cultivates difference. Anarchy turns away from treatment and compulsory integration, cultural integration. I'm thinking of the French and Muslims. Instead, it seeks to preserve space for people to do as they please. Let others be as they choose, do as they think best. Let them be. Yes, there are Heideggerian echoes there, and I'm willing to defend it. The radical individualism of the anarchic disposition is accompanied by anarchist understandings of anarchic solidarity. Kropotkin famously argued that mutual aid was central to anarchism in principle and in practice. These anarchists, these 19th century anarchists, saw mutual aid and solidarity as natural, and if unhindered by domination, inevitable. Most of these people, many of these people, were, like Kropotkin, observers of the natural world, and this lesson came easily to them. We learned that we are born as one of a kind, a part of and apart from others. We are born to a commons and to separate bodies. Others found their protection, learning, and fulfillment in common action, another form of mutual aid. This is not natural, not inevitable, and not given. Action in common is willful, chosen, and contingent. It does not possess the order that marks mutual aid among other species. Rather, it shows the freedom and fecundity of chaos. Chaos is the matrix of the new. It is in chaos that people find new ways of doing things. Ruth Kinna notes that Proudhon's anarchy as order runs counter to the common understanding of graffiti writers who mark their presence with the A in the O, that is to say, reflecting both anarchy and order. She sees these commonplace affirmations of the value of chaos, order, and disruption as a failure of learning and imagination. I see it as a call for change and a refusal of domination. I'm on the side of the graffiti artists. Although I really like Ruth Kidda. Chaos but chaos really deserves a big defense, because chaos is what makes radical change possible. If an established order, deeply rooted, hegemonic in its dominion over mind and practice, is to be altered and overcome, it must first be broken. That breaking opens the possibility of new thinking, the recovery of old ways, the invention of new ones, the reconsideration of what is one's own, the turning away from one's own to others. Where there were limits, they are no more. Chaos opens us to the new, not modernity. But perhaps modernity is the epoch that opens itself to the new. Perhaps in its legal rationality, perhaps on the other hand, in its legal rationality, in the rule-bound regimes of liberalism and the rigid orders of totalitarianism, monarchy is an epoch, not the only epoch, that seeks to end chaos, to render all life predictable and orderly. Anarchism has often sought to domesticate chaos, arguing that its chaotic force issues always and everywhere in order, solidarity and mutual aid. Yet in its popular manifestations, in carnivals and the carnivalesque, in the festive outlawry of pirates and lawbreakers in search of justice, in demonstrations, camps, and freedom schools, chaos shows its liberatory promise. Even in the most ordered system, chaos is necessary for change, for growth, and for liberation. Revolutions are necessarily moments of disorder and chaos. Even reform requires disruption. The experiences of colonization and revolution made the virtues of chaos a little more visible, I think, in the new worlds. There, escape, marronage, revolution, demonstrations, riots, uprisings are recognized not only as sites of danger and destruction, but of liberation and self-making. Anarchy has grown, not least in the commons, to recognize both people's radical solitude and the commons that enfolds them. In it, in anarchy, one recognizes the presence of natural orders enfolding the human and of the orders people create from their own will and choice. I see the relation of order and chaos, of self-reliance and solidarity, conveyed most clearly in Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun's accounts of the rise and fall of political power turn on the recognition that self-reliance is related to solidarity as, in Aristotle's phrase, concave is to convex. Political power, he argued, arises on the periphery. People on the periphery, distant from power, living a precarious life, face the dangers of the sparsely populated, settled frontier alone. With few resources, they are obliged to become inventive and resourceful themselves. They are stoic because they must be. They are courageous because they must be. They develop an iron discipline. It is among these frontiersmen, Ibn Khaldun argued, that power arises. They live at the hinge that binds self-reliance to solidarity. A life of self-reliance, disciplined by hardship, does not permit an arrogant overestimation of one's capacities. They know that they will need to join with others. They learn that solidarity gives them access to power. Those whose discipline is their own can bear hardship. They have courage. These qualities are preserved only with great difficulty in established political life. Comfort and clientelism erode them. Their solidarity, like their self-reliance, depends on circumstances, but it can be maintained by their discipline, their courage, and their judgment. Where these are eroded, rule must turn to bribery and force, and politics decays. Ibn Khaldun thought that dynastic power, indeed political power altogether, necessarily eroded over time. Solidarity built on individual strengths gave the anarchic people of the frontier the capacity to build. As they lost their self-reliance, their solidarity decayed. New forces arose on the periphery. There were, he thought, practices that could slow this process, but it was inevitable. Ibn Khaldun's account makes anarchy the origin and end of politics, that from which it arises and that to which it returns. One need not regard that intrinsic, inevitable changeability as a problem. On this account, anarchic solidarity is the site where freedom and access for the common good are joined. At this site, people are strongest, both individually and in their common action. At this site, freedom and solidarity are joined. Reaching and preserving that site should be our object. For Hobbes, for Locke, and above all for Hegel, anarchy is that which must be overcome. The moment of consent to rule in Hobbes vanishes rapidly to return only in a time of calamity. For Hegel, the state is the apex of human achievement. Anarchy stands against both these theories and their innumerable offspring. The influence of Hobbes pervades not only liberalism, not only in the liberal canon, but in ordinary discourse. Anarchy is understood as the war of all against all, filled with unconstrained violence. When the press refers to a city or a nation being given over to anarchy, they describe places filled with roving gangs, paramilitaries, militias, and warlords. None of this is anarchy. There is not an absence of rule. There is too much rule. It's just simple, right? It's not complicated here. There are too many weapons, and each weapon is a commanding power. When someone points a weapon at you or sends an armed drone or a ghost robotics dog or any of those things, they're claiming the power to annihilate you. This is no more and no less than an armed dictatorship, tyranny in its most intimate manifestation. This is not anarchy. This is authoritarianism. The concept of anarchy has been hollowed out, the contents replaced by its opposite. Tocqueville observed that an abstract term is like a box with a false bottom. You can put in what ideas you please and take them out again, unobserved. Yet it is rare to see the terrain of a concept so thoroughly occupied by enemy forces. This may testify to the danger anarchy poses to rulers and the promise it extends to the ruled. The saying, every accusation is a confession, applies here. We see anarchy seldom, partially, and briefly. Anarchy takes different forms according to the needs, ideals, and wills of those who turn to it. But we know authoritarianism all too well. Authoritarianism is maintained by violence. Authoritarianism operates outside and in defiance of the law. Thinkers from Xenophon to Arendt have recognized authoritarian rule as the domain of violence and fear. Violence brings tyrants to power, violence keeps them there. They employ not only the armies of whatever state they claim, but paramilitary, secret police, assassins, and vigilantes loyal only to them. Putin has Navalny poisoned, MBS, Abu Bonesaw, has Jamal Khashoggi killed and dismembered. Authoritarianism relies on power alone, and violence is the hand of power. Violence works not only through death, maiming, and torture, but most importantly, through the fear it instills. Arendt diagnosed the viral spread of fear in totalitarian regimes. Xenophon taught us that even the tyrant is not immune. They fear the very weapons on which they rely. But fear and violence are foundational not only to tyrants and totalitarian regimes, they are foundational to liberalism as well. Liberalism fears tyrants, but it also fears the people. Liberalism drives toward the overcoming of fear to peace and security, but it is continually threatened by the fears it hopes to master and the weapons upon which it relies. And here I mean weapons literally. It is, as Charles Tilly noted, operative in the most modern, most liberal of states. In War Making as State Making as Organized Crime, Tilly mapped the perverse logic of fear that animates the ever-growing construction of defenses. Sheldon Wolin diagnosed the perverse economy of fearful psychology and the policy of ever greater weapons acquisition that also operates here. There is never enough protection. The weapons of mass destruction we acquire serve not to reassure us, but rather to make us more sensitive to dangers. Convinced of our ability to deter danger, we become hypersensitive to every threat, unwilling, perhaps unable, to risk any diminution of omnipotence in armed power. That's the violence part. The imputation of criminality to anarchy is more complex. The gangs and warlords presented as symptoms of anarchy are often authorities in embryo as well as authorities in practice. Aristocrats, Thomas Paine wrote, I love that guy, are nothing but a great gang. The winning warlord, draped in gold braid and recognized by the UN, can grace any official table while continuing his violent depredations on a grander scale. Authoritarian regimes and all that ilk traffic in criminality, to be sure. They are notoriously corrupt, thieving, and murderous. Criminality is not a privilege of authoritarian governments. It is a prerequisite. It is constitutive. They are criminal enterprises from top to bottom, extracting resources from the world, engaging in murder, torture, and violent coercion. They assassinate, they dismember. No law restrains them. Yet they often maintain the law for others with extraordinary rigor. It may be in resistance to this asymmetric law of domination that the ascription of criminality to anarchists begins. Ordinary criminality, robbing a bookseller, for example, is antithetical to anarchism. Kropotkin argued exactly that when a bookseller reproached him for encouraging his students to steal the books in his shop. Kropotkin, you remember this, he did. He not only persuaded the students to stop, he wrote an essay on the subject of why this is bad. Even their enemies recognize that mafiosi, grifters, and paramilitary gangsters are not anarchists. Anarchism's outlaws are pirates and bandits, those who rule themselves, often apart from or in opposition to the regime that rules them, those who steal from the rich to give to the poor, those like Harriet Tubman who defy the law to bring people to freedom. The imputation of lawlessness to anarchy, unlike the imputation of violence, has truth at its core. Anarchy is before, beyond, beneath, and above the law. Those who are free from domination are ruled only by the laws they make, laws given its power by their action and consent. Freedom from law belongs to them as the law's judges and as people who can depart from law's reach. It should not surprise us that anarchists often willingly embrace the figure of the outlaw. There's so many people. I wanted to talk about pirates and queer sex, but I won't. But just remember it's there. In his work on bandits and banditry, Eric Hobsbawm found other outlaws and bandits whose outlawry inspired him to call them primitive rebels. Scott points to common practices of evading state authority among peasants. These, ranging from oblique insults and deception to escape, resistance, and rebellion, are the weapons of the weak, mentioned earlier today. These populations often seek to escape state power in inaccessible places, in forests and mountains. So too with the maroon communities of escaped and rebellious slaves. The late David Graeber wrote of pirate settlements in the African communities of Zana Malata, which I'm probably saying wrong, that surrounded, sheltered, and taught them. Graeber had a critical role in popularizing anarchism in the 21st century. Like Kropotkin, Graeber recognized that anarchy is commonplace. In Are You an Anarchist? The answer may surprise you. He was your friend, and I'm sorry about that. But he sounds so Midwestern to me. I have no idea where he came from. Was he a Midwestern guy?
No, it's New York.
This is such a Midwestern thing. Are you an anarchist? The answer may surprise you. He detailed the ordinary ways in which people act anarchically. They are committed to equality. They do not elbow others aside when they stand in line, even in the absence of the police. Indeed, most of us would scoff at the idea that police are necessary to protect us from shovers. We can protect each other and ourselves. The emptying out of the political concept of anarchism, accompanied by the attribution of violence and criminality to anarchists, has served to distort and discredit anarchy. It has also erased the contributions of anarchists to the ostensibly European Enlightenment. In Pirate Enlightenment, Graeber argued Africa was an important site for radical political experiments, at least radical in European terms, well before the Enlightenment took hold in its imputed homeland. Knowledge of these traveled as so much popular learning you did in this period. This is also something that Redeker and Leinbau have written a lot about. Among the crews of state-flagged company and pirate ships, on ships, where the most literate populations in the world were, because I know this as a Navy child, there's a lot of downtime on a ship. And people taught each other to read. How great, this is so great, I love this. Whether these came as romantic stories of utopian settlements or as knowledge of the maroon communities of escaped slaves, or reports on alien economic and social institutions by military and governmental officers, Anarchic practices were part of the ship's cargo. Anarchy permits action in common, but it makes that action clearly dependent on consent. Laws can be made, work can be undertaken, always and only with the recognition that it is dependent on the consent of those involved. Anarchy is famously resistant to state power. Anarcho-syndicalism and anarcho-communism have opened acceptance of collective institutions among anarchists. Indeed, cooperatives, unions, and other forms of collective action have been integral to anarchism from its modern beginning as instances of mutual aid and collective direct action. Am I running late yet?
Do you have 10 minutes?
Okay, I'll talk fast. The forms and practices of these in history and theory stand in opposition to states, and states have stood as the enemy of anarchists since the 19th century. I actually think that capital is probably a greater threat to us as a form of domination than the state is, and I'm happy to talk about it. But I'm going to talk briefly, because that's what I've got, about the state. I think there are fundamental, the state is correctly seen as the enemy, though not the only enemy of anarchy. Two state forms, apart from the obvious authoritarianism, are antithetical to anarchy. First, the Weberian conception of the state is defined by territorial control and a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. Neither of these qualities is consistent with anarchism. The core tenet of anarchism, the right of individuals to live their lives free from domination, entails the freedom to come and go, to migrate and to depart to come and to go without hindrance. The second antithetical form is the ethno-state. This form is predicated on the belief that people ought to live with their own kind, understood in racial and ethnic terms. You can see the influence of Hegel here, but much more proximately the hands of Woodrow Wilson and Jan Smuts, the man who resegregated Washington, D.C., and a man intimately involved in the architecture of apartheid. The ethno-state is the mirror image of anarchy, formally similar, perversely reversed. Anarchists understand embodied individuals as entitled by nature to live their lives as they choose, free from domination. In the ethno-state, nature is the source and justification for systems of hierarchy and dominion. The ethno-state regards difference as a problem and seeks to sequester differences in separate states or subordinate institutions, Bantustans, reservations, whatever, which are intended to establish enduring and impermeable boundaries, fencing the other out. Self-determination belongs not to individuals, but to natural collectives, embodied collectives. So, the ethno-state and the Weberian state are fundamentally opposed to anarchy. Indeed, all institutions designed to be permanent and unchanging are at odds with anarchy and with the human condition. There are, however, constitutive features that might make some governmental forms more consistent with anarchy. These should be grounded in the consent of the governed, not in some more or less distant past, but in the present. They should be radically decentralized. They should recognize that people have rights the power of government cannot touch. Those rights are not creations of law, they are carried in the flesh. And here I want to remind you of Baldwin quoted earlier. It's not just history you carry in the flesh. It is, I want to argue, sovereignty. Rights belong to people, not states. No state has a right to exist. People have the right to be governed in the ways they choose and by institutions and practices they consent to. States, constitutions, laws ought to aim at being useful rather than enduring. There is no consent that binds people forever. No group of people has the right to bind those yet to come. States, constitutions, laws have no right to exist apart from the consent of the people, a consent predicated on a constant assessment of their continued appropriateness and utility. As this may suggest, I think there is an intimate connection between democracy and anarchy, though a much more uneasy connection and probably resistance to constitutionalism. Democracy, I think, grows from and toward anarchy. It will grow according to its seeds and its soil. The radical diversity of individuals and the common actions they conceive together drive us to history and practice. So I have one example of this, which I'm deeply fond of, but I think it is a bit eccentric. But I'll give it to you anyway. I mean, I don't know why I love this so much. I do know why I love this so much. I'm not usually an Anglophile, but whatever. In one of the great moments of politics, the soldiers who had defeated the royalist army of Charles Stuart, called Charles I, sat down on the fields of Putney and said they will go no further unless they knew what government they were fighting for. That in itself is like good enough. They saw the threats of restoration and autocracy before them, and they would be defeated. Yet their work remains testimony to the relation of individual rights, autonomy, individual consent, and legitimate government. They rise up from the past to remind us that the right to rule is granted not by descent or divine right, to be sure, not by conquest nor by law, but only by the consent of the governed. During those debates, Colonel Thomas Rainsborough said, this is the best part, I think the poorest he that is in England hath a life to live as the greatest he. And therefore, truly, sir, I think it's clear that every man that is to live under a government ought first by his own consent to put himself under that government. And one of his fellow officers says, that's natural rights, to which we say, yes. So it was, and so it remains. People's lives are at once radically individual and willfully and naturally interdependent. Reflection on the separateness of people, that each has a life to live, affirms that this life is at once alike and different from all the others. The demand, the democratic demand, for what each needs to live that life, accords with a hard-won recognition that equality is not sameness. People have the same need for food and shelter, for clean water, soil, for healthcare and education. Their lives, their distinctive bodies and minds, demand different food, different education, different tools for their hands, different tools for their minds. These diverse democratic demands belong to the natural rights to, in the language of my people, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Anarchists recognize that dominion is exercised, and this is not as long as it should be because I don't know enough. It's exercised much more by capital and by corporations than it is by the state. Who surveils you? The state doesn't do it. They don't have the capacity. Who surveils you? Your credit card company. They know your life in ways that the state will never know. They control where you work, what you do, whom you work for. There is no choice in the free market. There is no freedom in the free market. And yet, this is bracketed by us as if it were somehow a separate domain that anarchists should not touch. Luckily, anarchists are not very boundary observant. So it is that, sorry, I deeply regret not being able to say more about this. Anarchy continues. Am I 2 minutes? Okay. 3? 3, okay. Like a trinity. Anarchy continues in economics as in politics, whether we see it, whether we acknowledge it or not. The commons is present for us on the beaches of California, the rivers and lakes of Wisconsin, the acequias of New Mexico. People are at home with it. My brother in Wisconsin is not troubled when people show up to fish in his lake or take their catch home. The wealthy and arrogant who from time to time fence off pieces of California beaches and claim them for their private use learn that people will not tolerate it. They take the fences down. Those who maintain the ancient acequias do not charge for water or pay for labor. They follow a practice long older than the rule of the United States. Anarchy is also visible in exceptional moments. Consider 9/11. I sort of think we consider 9/11 altogether too much, but consider 9/11. The president was reading a goat story, a story about goats to children. Local governments struggled to organize a response, but ordinary people rushed in. Some were firemen, police, rescue workers, but who acting not on orders, but on their own judgment. Others were just ordinary people. And this happens all the time. When there are floods, neighbors with boats rescue neighbors on roofs. When there are earthquakes or bombs, people struggle to free those trapped in the ruins. They dig with their shovels and with their bare hands. When the ice cracks under the weight of a man or dog or deer, people work to rescue the endangered. The internet is full of this stuff. They don't need orders, and they arrive a lot faster than the state. People, unprompted by commands or rulers, do what needs to be done. Also, in many small ways, people leave space for anarchy in their daily lives. We decide what laws we will obey and what we will ignore. We cross against the light. We cross in the middle of the street. We decide if it's safe, and we set the law aside. There are also still so many silly laws on the books, and we ignore them. It is as if they do not exist. They are as fully annulled as if they had been formally annulled, more so. Anarchic people are the people most able to rule themselves. They will do so as individuals in their separate lives. They may do so collectively. When they do, they, of all people, recognize that they retain sovereignty. They are sovereign not only collectively as the people, but as people. Each individual and the radical individuality of the human body carry sovereignty within them, in their bodies. The idea of the people is an abstraction, a concept, perhaps an aspiration. Oh, that's my talk, isn't it? Perhaps a temptation. We will never see the people. Some are dead, some are yet to arrive. This conception of sovereignty is abstract, unified, uniform, and centralized. Anarchy endures in embodied sovereignty. In this understanding, sovereignty is held within the body. The people gives way to people. People rule. Each rules partially, imperfectly, incompletely. Yet each has, partially, imperfectly, incompletely, the right to rule. They rule themselves, to be sure, but if they decide to join together, each has a share in the rule of all. That rule is necessarily decentralized. They rule where they stand. In the jury box, in the voting booth, barring the door to protect immigrants, on the street, blocking traffic. They are executives, judges, legislators. They decide what laws to execute, what commands to give, obey, or countermand. They make and unmake laws. This sovereignty of the people is how democracy is legitimated. I do not mean to suggest here, this is it, that democracy is an evolutionary successor to the anarchy. Quite the contrary. Democratic government is not properly understood as a supplement to anarchy, as that which adds only to replace. Anarchy precedes democracy. If we are fortunate, anarchy will succeed it. Anarchy continues under and in democracies, in practice as in legitimation. Anarchy lives within them. The more anarchy lives within them, the more democratic the people could become, and the more rapidly they may approach the end of rule. Thank you.